And on to the details now. U.S. President Joe Biden pledged long-term support for Ukraine on Thursday alongside NATO leaders and said he has no reason to talk to Russian President Vladimir Putin right now unless the Russian leader changes his behavior. U.S. President Joe Biden vowed that the United States cannot retreat from the world and said under his leadership, Washington will not walk away from support for Ukraine. Last year, the G7 nations committed to the declaration for Ukraine's long-term protection. Shortly after, 25 additional countries signed bilateral security agreements with Ukraine. Now, a year later, over 20 countries, along with the European Union, have completed and signed these agreements.
I'm dealing with Xi right now and direct contact with him. I have no good reason to talk to Putin right now. There's not much that he is prepared to do in terms of accommodating any change in his behavior.
Well, at a news conference concluding the NATO summit, Biden said a strong NATO alliance is essential to American security. He also said NATO leaders and partners discussed the need for a new industrial policy among Western countries and how to boost the capacity, particularly of Europe and Japan, to produce their own weapon systems, and would meet again. Meanwhile, the solo press conference at the NATO summit in Washington since the debate night proved to be disastrous for Biden. He mistakenly referred to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as President Putin before correcting himself.
Now I want to hand it over to the President of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. You can beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
Thank you so much.
And U.S. President defended his health, saying he would take another neurological exam to determine his mental acuity if it is recommended to him by his doctors. Biden has been under intense scrutiny in recent days and has faced doubts, including from members of his own Democratic Party, about his re-election chances after a weak and faltering performance in a debate late last month against Republican former President Donald Trump. He mixed up the name of his Vice President, Kamala Harris, and his Republican rival, Donald Trump, too.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be Vice President, but I think she was not qualified to be President. So let's start there. Number one. The fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for President. I beat him once, and I will beat him again.
Biden also said that the Israel-Gaza war must end now, telling reporters his Gaza ceasefire framework had been agreed on by both Israel and Palestinian Islamist group Hamas, but added that there were still gaps to close.
For months, the United States has been working to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, to bring the hostages home, to create a path for peace and stability in the Middle East. 6 weeks ago, I laid out a detailed plan in writing. It was endorsed by the UN Security Council, the G7. That framework is now agreed on by both Israel and Hamas. So I sent my team to the region to hammer out the details. These are difficult, complex issues. There's still gaps to close, but we're making progress. The trend is positive. And I'm determined to get this deal done and bring an end to this war, which should end now.
And for more on this, Nick Harper joins us from Washington, D.C. Well, Nick, Ukrainian President, Biden's continued gaffes, majorly the verbal slip-ups have continued, calling Harris Trump and Zelensky as Putin, where he has not only taken wrong names, but also mixed the political opponents. So the trouble mounts for him more, is it?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, these are embarrassing gaffes for the president, but I would say that he performed much better during this almost hour-long press conference than many people expected. Perhaps partly because the bar was so low after that disastrous debate exactly 2 weeks ago, when all of these questions about his mental agility, his fitness to be able to run for re-election came to the fore. He forcefully pushed back during this hour-long press conference against a whole host of brutal questions, suggesting that America's standing on the world stage was being diminished for his insistence of staying in the race. He said that he wanted to get the job done, that he would keep moving. And he said there was only one situation in which he would drop out, and that was if the polls said that he could not beat Donald Trump in November. And he said there were no polls that were showing that. And yet, despite all of this, despite the insistence that he is the best qualified man to beat Donald Trump and to bring the Democrats to victory in November, there are growing numbers of lawmakers within his own party who are saying he needs to step aside. And I think the next 24, 48 hours will be key for the president. Will we see a whole raft of Democrats come forward, now that the important NATO summit is over, to tell President Biden it's time to step aside? Because the calls to do so certainly seem to be getting louder, and it's not clear at this stage whether he did enough during this press conference to allay those fears and to quieten all of those Democrats who are saying it's time to suspend the re-election bid.
All right. As you said, growing voices within his party. Already, two leaders have joined the list of those who want him to withdraw from the race. We would want to get an assessment on where the campaign will go ahead now, as the calls for him to reassess his decision grow shriller and louder, as you mentioned.
I mean, it's very hard to tell at this stage, but I think we will see more Democrats defect over the coming hours, over the coming days. It may be a question of how long he can now stay in the race. I think it's important to note, a couple of days ago, Nancy Pelosi said that there was still a conversation to be had, because throughout this whole process, President Biden is saying the conversation is over. I am running for re-election. Essentially, let's stop talking about it. But Nancy Pelosi, the former House Speaker, a very influential Democrat, said really the conversation still needs to be present and ongoing. And she suggested that once the NATO summit was over, that would be the time to reconsider. We are now through the NATO summit, and I think many Democrats will be reconsidering and thinking whether or not they want Biden at the top of the ticket in November, because there is a real concern with his age at 81 and seeming to be getting even weaker by the week, it would seem, struggling even more with some of his sentences, struggling to formulate some of his ideas. There is a real concern that he wouldn't be able to finish a full 4 years in office if he were to be re-elected in November.
All right. Also, if we talk about Biden, also called for end of Gaza war, extending support for reaching a ceasefire. He also said there should be no occupation of Gaza once the hostilities cease. What can you tell us about this? As Biden mentioned, there were still gaps to close.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he has been pushing this peace plan that he presented as an Israeli peace plan several weeks ago. And we still haven't seen the two sides coming together. Hamas and Israel still do not agree to that three-phase plan. President Biden said much of what had happened in recent months was due to that very conservative position that the Israeli government holds. Now, Joe Biden would like to see, or at least ensure, that there is no Israeli presence on the day after the war, that Israeli troops leave and then the Palestinians work out amongst themselves how to self-govern. But part of the problem is that the Israelis feel very differently. So although he's continuing to push these ideas, to present them on the world stage, the two sides who ultimately need to decide it, Israel and Hamas, are not agreeing to those proposals.
Also, what can we make out of his statement on continued support to Ukraine and a very forceful NATO statement against China?
Yeah, very forceful. On Ukraine, first of all, no real surprise about what we saw during the course of this summit, it was dominated by Ukraine. The fact that President Zelensky was here mixing with world leaders, mixing with the Western alliance, it was expected that it would be at the fore. And as expected, the NATO alliance promised that pathway to membership to the NATO alliance for Ukraine. No timeline of exactly when that would happen. Plenty more financial and military support to the tune of about 43 billion US dollars over the course of the next year. F-16 fighter jets heading to Ukraine in the coming months for the very first time, and more air defense systems. On China, some of the most forceful language we've seen to date. We haven't seen the NATO alliance be as critical as it was here in Washington, DC, really than ever before. It called China a decisive enabler of the war in Ukraine, criticizing the fact that there was that strategic alliance between Moscow and Beijing, but also saying that because Beijing was continuing to supply arms, or at least components to produce arms to Moscow, that was furthering Moscow's campaign in Ukraine. NATO very clearly saying that it was looking at security not just in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific, and calling out China as being one of the people who were continuing to propel this war in Ukraine forward.
All right, Nick, thank you so much for all that update from there.